Welcome back to the Anti-Meta Club. After last week's race, unfortunately, we were not given something quite as fun, but it is still pretty fun. It's one of those Group 4 races that has kind of a Joker lap requirement, but anyways, I found an anti-meta car. Let's get into it. The anti-meta car of the week is the Huracan. Surprisingly nimble with obviously great grip due to the all-wheel drive, you don't actually have to worry about the tire wear despite the fact that most Gran Turismo all-wheel drive cars in Group 4 have really bad tire wear. This one doesn't. Not only can you keep up with the 4C, but you can also pass it in the straight, which is of course super important. It's pretty obvious when you look at the leaderboard that the 4C is the meta car. With that said, both the NSX and the Huracan are both anti-meta choices, but I went ahead and chose the Huracan because I just like driving it more. I was able to put it in 41st, which I believe was the second fastest Huracan at the time, but that has certainly changed, and there are definitely 2 to 3 tenths left in the lap that I did. Looking to the first corner, luckily the number boards are up on the fence, so it makes them super easy to see even in traffic. Right before the 200-foot board is when I brake, but you want to actually brake a couple feet earlier than I did because I didn't have quite as much speed as I would like. Decelerating in a straight line, we're going to turn in after the 100-foot board, and while you can use this high part of the curb, I like to miss it. As you can see, I barely grazed it, got on that throttle as soon as I hit the apex, and I continued steering to make sure that I'm, of course, using as much of the track as possible, but you don't want to go beyond that curb because it will give you a penalty. For the uphill S, I find it really important to actually ride on the curbs. You want to put your tires on those curbs. It not only allows you to draw a shorter line, a shorter and straighter line through the section, but it's making use of all of the track, as much of the track as you possibly can. That of course allows you to steer as little as possible so you can maintain as much momentum as you can. Approaching the bus stop, obviously you want to keep your eye on the number boards, and right after the 300-foot board is when you're going to hit the brakes. We're actually going to stay in 6th gear as we initially enter, and we're not going to downshift to 5th until we've made it past the first part of the chicane. As I go over the first bump, I like to completely come off both pedals, making sure that I'm not trying to move the weight whatsoever. When I hit the solid pavement after the first curb, that's when I start turning in and add just a little bit of brake to guide the car where I want it to go. Adding just a little bit more brake for the final section. We're not actually going to focus too much on the first curb as much as the second. We're going to downshift to 4th and immediately get fully on the throttle. As you go over the final part of the curbing, we're going to change directions and lift off the throttle just a little bit to get the car, again, to move the direction that we want it to go. From here, you'll notice that I'm gradually releasing the throttle, coming off the throttle and only adding brakes finally once we do fully come off the throttle, looking for this little access road here on the right. It's at that point I want to make sure that I'm fully on the throttle. What you want to do is turn into the corner as much as you want to first, then add throttle, making sure that the car doesn't change the attitude, doesn't change the direction whatsoever when you do add the throttle. If you can add the throttle gentle enough after fully adding the steering at that one access road, you can hold that angle and you should be able to accelerate all the way through to the next braking point. From here I shifted to 6th gear. I'm not actually sure if it's faster to do so, but you can actually stay in 5th gear. Right before the 200-foot board on the wall is when you want to brake and turn in simultaneously. You'll see that I actually braked a little bit too late, causing the car to oversteer and rotate in the corner. I was able to drift out of it and maintain my momentum, but that's definitely not optimal. I lost a little bit of time there, as you can see from all that countersteer and all that sliding. If I had done it correctly, I still would have committed to the throttle and just tracked out wide here and then immediately went to the left to set up for the next corner. Where the barriers change on the left here is where you brake. Now, you've got to make sure that you're either straightened out or you've got enough space so that when you do inevitably understeer just a little bit as you brake, you don't go into the grass. We want to turn in, get all the way up on this curb and back on the throttle, of course. Continue steering to make sure that you don't understeer all the way into that wall. It's going to ruin your lap. You don't want that. Also, make sure that you're to the right of the white line, at least 2 of your tires, and then it's just full throttle all the way to the end. It's a pretty short lap, but that actually means that every mistake is kind of magnified, so good luck with this one. Like I mentioned in the breakdown, I actually didn't have as much speed as you probably will entering this first corner, so brake a little bit earlier than I did. I do suggest avoiding the high part of the inside curb, and of course you've got to use as much of this outside curb as you can. Remember, you just need 2 tires touching the curb for it to be valid. Don't be shy to actually ride on these curbs, especially in the time trial. You should do it in the race as well. You'll find that you're giving yourself a bit of an advantage over the people who try to avoid the curbs. There's really no reason to avoid the curbs, and using it allows you to use more of the track and to steer a little bit less. I'll save the lesson for exactly why, but to keep the car stable, make sure that you don't spam the downshifts. Downshift late, and you can actually keep the car a little bit more stable. The idea of this really long corner is to gradually decelerate to the point you want to get on the throttle. You're trying to carry as much speed as you possibly can through as much of the corner as you can. In the breakdown, you see that I drifted this next left-hander. It's because I actually braked too late, so brake a little bit earlier than I did and maintain some brake pressure as you enter the corner. You should be able to keep it stable, and if you keep it stable, it's going to be faster. On this final corner, I actually bled off a little bit too much speed. You can actually carry more speed and apex a little bit later, and you'll have a much better time. I do think that at the very least, a 0.2 or 0.3 as possible, if not even faster with the Huracan. Probably much faster, actually. My general feeling from the community when it comes to races like this is that it's pretty boring. A lot of people, at least a lot of people in the general populace, don't quite understand the depths of a strategy that could be available with the requirements of this race. Now, obviously, it's not quite as great as last week's race, and it's a far cry from the last, I believe it was a nation's race, it might have been a manufacturer's race, where the softs and mediums were both viable on a no-stop. And depending on exactly what you wanted to do and what car you had, either one would work, and people were actually finishing really close at the end of the race. Anyways, I'm just kind of ranting. What I'm talking about is the fact that this is the kind of race where tire wear barely matters, fuel doesn't matter whatsoever, and the only bit of strategy that you can really employ is deciding when to pit. I would personally love to see the kind of race where we have multiple strategies being viable, but at the very least, it's not a short sprint and it's not a sub 8-minute race like Race C was, I believe, only 2 weeks ago. So I'm actually pretty happy with this race. Not only can you actually affect the outcome of the race by choosing right, there are various cars that work. Now, the 4C is obviously the meta car. I think the Huracan and NSX are just as good in the right hands, and there are a few cars that are almost as fast as them. Now, there are, of course, many cars in Group 4 that will not work whatsoever. There are a lot of cars that I absolutely would not use, but there are a few that do work that aren't the meta or even the non-meta car. I can't believe I just said non-meta. It's another one of those situations where I was talking for so long and I didn't put little cuts in between everything I was saying. I do not want to re-record all of that, and we're just going to continue talking. Now, if you've done this race, you probably know that it gets pretty crazy at the bus stop, and I thought that I was prepared for it. I went on the inside. I thought that G. Ramos would either slide way past me or ghost. He did neither of them, so I ended up with some damage, but it was okay. I didn't get a penalty. Unfortunately, Nasty got a penalty. I don't think he deserved a 3-second for that, unless maybe he caused that and I didn't see. I don't know, but either way, we came out relatively unscathed and we're already in 11th place. Now, as we go into the final sequence of corners, we can now determine if anyone in front of us is going to the pits, and while it didn't look like anyone was, only Nasty was in front of me, and in front of him, there weren't very many people except for a couple people pretty far up. At that moment, I thought, okay, we can actually use the Veyron for a slipstream going up the hill. Hopefully, we'll be able to pass Nasty, and worst case scenario, he's going to have to serve that penalty. We'll be in front of him, and then if we get too close to the Ferrari in front of him, we can go in the pits after that, and it should be fine. One of the things that I mentioned in both the lap breakdown as well as the full speed lap is a lot of people seem to be afraid to use all of the curbs, and that's actually why I was able to catch up to this guy so quickly. He's in the Veyron. He also might not be shifting at the proper time, but the Veyron is no longer so quick that you can't keep up with it, especially if the driver is making errors like that. Now, seeing him defend here, it looked like a normal defense. I wasn't too worried, but I was also hoping that I could sneak by. When people go really wide exiting the bus stop, you can usually sneak on the inside, but it also seemed like maybe he wasn't paying a ton of attention. It looked like he was trying to cut off my nose, but then again, when I went on the inside again, he gave me full space. I'm not quite sure what he was thinking, because after I passed him, he went directly in the 4C, but luckily stopped short of putting him entirely off the track. That actually worked in my favor because it made it so the 4C couldn't get all the way up next to me, and I didn't have to defend very hard. Now, you might think right now is a perfect time to pit, and actually it wouldn't be a bad time to pit, especially considering the fact that I was already making mistakes and it caused Hellsfire to run into me, one of the fastest drivers that I race against in the fastest meta car, and I was making mistakes. Sorry, Hellsfire. What's funny is I'd actually completely forgotten about what had just happened. If you watch the replay, well, not if you watch the replay, if you watch this video over again, if you rewind a little bit, you'll see that he just barely dipped his front tire in the grass when he hit the brakes, and that was the outcome. So this is a PSA to keep your tires out of the grass when you're hitting the brakes. Now, I'd also mentioned that this car can get pretty squirrely in the bus stop, and usually you wouldn't see me do these kinds of things, especially in the video that I'm making when I could just edit this out, but I thought it was important to show exactly what can happen. Now, I actually carried too much speed, and I came off the brakes super quickly as I went over that first curb rather than getting off them before that, so it kind of upset the weight balance of the car and just sent me completely sideways. I tried to recover, just went straight in the wall. Fast forward 5 more laps, I'm actually in the same position I was in, but we've caught up to a 4C. Now, this moment is one of the main reasons that I chose this car as the anti-meta car. You can see that we have pretty much maintained the same momentum coming out of that corner. In fact, he was a little bit faster for just a brief second, but as soon as we go up the hill, we're getting closer and closer. And of course, the closer we get to him, the more the slipstream is going to affect us, and we're going to be able to cut through that air even better. In situations like this, of course, we need to be careful, especially since I had already spun out in the bus stop. You got to be really careful when dirty air is a part of it, but as long as you're really gentle, you don't try to push too much, you can be really aggressive on the exit, and as you can see, we cut out 4 more tenths from that Metacar. You can also see that when you do have the dirty air, it doesn't really affect you too much on that long sweeping corner, which is obviously a very good thing. Jumping ahead one more lap, not only have we gotten the fastest lap 3 consecutive times, but we are now caught up to the person that we were behind before we spun out. If you've done this race, you'll realize that 14.4 isn't that quick, especially with a car that's supposed to beat the meta, but this was actually the very first time that I'd done this race, so I was kind of figuring it out as I went. What was really interesting to see is that Bama Milo was in the McLaren, which used to be the Metacar, at least at some points, and we're catching him so incredibly quick, despite the fact that he has slipstream from the Metacar, that it really seems that that car is dead in the water, unfortunately. Like I mentioned before, you can definitely sneak past people if they exit too wide out of the bus stop, and this was one of those situations. I saw he went pretty wide. I don't know if it was by design or not, but I was able to sneak all the way on the inside, and we carried more speed despite the fact that we were in a tighter line. So it was pretty cool to make that kind of pass work. On top of that, Bama Milo actually said hi, and I forgot to say hi to him. I don't think I actually know him. If you're a fan of these videos, and that is where you know me, hello, I'm sorry I didn't say hi to you, but good racing. As we're finishing this lap, we're once again in a position to show what this car can do against the Metacar. This time we're only 4 tenths behind, and we're going into the very first corner. Of course, that leads to the full throttle section, the uphill full throttle section, which isn't quite a straight because, of course, it curves, but it might as well be a straight because it has the same effects. If you're stuck in someone's slipstream long enough, you will be able to pass them at the end or maybe even before. If you find yourself passing a car this early up this full throttle section, then I definitely suggest defending as soon as you possibly can, because there is a long enough time after passing someone that early for them to then pass you, or at the very least get next to you, which could make it really difficult for you to navigate the corner. Now, as you can see, he didn't quite get all the way next to me, but if I'd left the door open, he might go for a dive and he might be able to make it. Now, I was a little bit scared initially, but I did think I had enough momentum to get past that guy. I did, but the guy behind me did not, which is really unfortunate. Now, obviously, that kind of thing can happen in racing, but if this were a real race, I cannot imagine a person that went all the way off there would then jump back on the track, which is, of course, exactly what someone who's just playing a video game would want to do. And when a race is a maximum of about 20 to 22 minutes, there's not a lot of incentive for people to be super patient, and there's a lot of incentive for people to be super aggressive, which is why the ghost system is really awesome, but unfortunately, the ghost doesn't seem to work when people are rejoining almost perpendicular at full speed in that corner. Now, if you look at the left side of the screen, you can see that I'm currently in 8th place, which, if you ask me, is pretty good considering the fact that I completely spun out and ran into a wall, giving myself damage, putting myself almost in last place. But if we jump all the way to the almost end of the penultimate lap, you can see that there are still a number of people who haven't gone into the pits. If you are familiar with this channel, if you've been here for a while, then you know that I always talk about the specific strategy of this specific type of race being that you just want to go in the pits when there's not going to be anyone else in front of you. And of course, that's hard to predict and hard to control, but there are a few things you can do. Now, what we did was not exactly on purpose, but it had the same effect. Despite the fact that I spun out, hit a wall, and got damage, I had so much free air for so long that I was able to hit a fairly good, consistent pace, and that net me 4th place going into the final lap. The effect that racing through traffic has is so incredibly drastic when it comes to your consistent pace that even if you crash and spin out, you can still end up passing multiple people who simply had to battle through traffic. As I mentioned before, this is actually the very first race that I did in the Huracan, and you can see that I'm purple by a good amount. The optimal lap that I have would probably put us actually in the 13th, the lap that I have now after spending more time on this. I'm definitely sure that this car can get 13.9. I think it might be able to get a 13.8 in the right hands or a 13.7. And yeah, that's about it. Just like always, stay out of the traffic, stay out of the fights, do whatever you can to time your pit, and you should be able to pull off a really good result. As always, thank you very much for watching my video. If you like what you saw, please don't forget to like and subscribe. And of course, I'm going to be leaving you with a look at my current members. Thank you guys. I love every one of you. Have a good day.